stench of stagnant water and rotting garbage in the narrow, dark alleyway was thick enough to choke a normal man, but my focus was entirely locked on the figures blocking my path. Over a dozen members of the Black Tiger Gang stood there, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering overhead lights as they aggressively waved their high-carbon steel staves and machetes. Their faces were twisted with a crude, aggressive bloodlust, their eyes tracking me like predators that cornered a wounded beast. Around us, the black market vendors who had been aggressively shouting over their makeshift stalls only moments ago were now moving with a silent, practiced urgency. They knew the unwritten laws of this underground world perfectly. They quickly packed their goods, cleared a massive open space in the muddy alley, and melted into the deep shadows to avoid being splashed by the inevitable spray of blood. I stood dead center in that opening, my gaze entirely calm as I surveyed the crowd. My left hand remained loose at my side, and I made no move to reach for the silver soul weapon case strapped to my back. To draw a legacy weapon against street-level thugs of this caliber would be a pure, embarrassing waste. However, my current situation was far from ideal. My right arm throbbed with a relentless, burning agony, and beneath the skin, I could see the dark red poison lines of the nether corpsey chi, continuing to spread outward like a spiderweb. The limb hung completely stiff and dead by my side, entirely unable to exert even a fraction of its normal strength. I was effectively fighting one-handed, relying solely on my legs, my left arm, and the deeply ingrained reflexes of my training. Yellow Hair rushed at the very front of the pack, letting out a wild howl as the high-carbon steel staff in. His hand sliced through the air, whistling with a terrifying velocity as he aimed it directly at my skull. I could see the twisted excitement on his face. He was already imagining the exact moment my brain would splatter across the muddy ground. Behind him, the remaining lackeys followed his lead with excited, animalistic roars, fanning out rapidly to seal off every single potential escape route I had. They thought they had trapped a helpless F-rank piece of trash, completely blind to the fact that they were stepping into a meat grinder. Deep within my mind, the profound muscle memory of ultimate combat mastery instantly took complete control over my entire nervous system, suppressing the phantom pain of the poison and sharpening my focus down to an absolute edge. I didn't retreat a single step. Instead, I leaned forward, the muscles in my left leg tightening like a coiled spring as my waist snapped with explosive power, throwing my body directly into the oncoming crowd. Yellow Hair only felt his vision blur as the heavy high-carbon steel staff struck empty air, completely missing its mark. I had slipped through his trajectory with a fluid, terrifyingly precise movement, shifting my center of gravity entirely to the blind spot of his swing. Immediately after, a tearing, sharp pain radiated from his abdomen before he could even process that I was no longer in front of him. I delivered a clean, brutal, and decisive side kick with my left leg, the heel landing solidly against Yellow Hair's exposed ribs. The dull, sickening sound of bones cracking echoed sharply through the narrow brick walls of the dark alley. The sheer kinetic force of the impact lifted his feet entirely off the ground, sending him flying backward through the air like a broken rag doll. He heavily knocked over 3 accomplices who were rushing up right behind him, collapsing into a tangled heap of limbs and weapons. Dark, thick blood sprayed wildly from his mouth, splashing directly onto the terrified faces of the surrounding gang members. The initial shock of the impact sent a ripple of hesitation through the front line, but the sheer momentum of their numbers pushed them forward. Blood rushed to their ears, their instincts defaulting to raw, desperate violence as they realized I wasn't the easy target they had assumed. The smell of copper from Yellow Hair's sprayed blood seemed to ignite a frantic, cornered energy in them. They couldn't pull back now, not in front of their boss, and certainly not against a lone, one-armed opponent. Hack him to death, altogether. Don't let him breathe, Li Hu shouted and cursed violently from the back of the alley, jumping in an absolute rage as his eyes turned bloodshot. He waved his mechanical arm, the engine revving to a screeching pitch, but he remained safely behind his wall of meat. At his command, the hesitation vanished, replaced by an ugly, panicked aggression. Blade light flashed instantly in the dim light as a chaotic rain of clubs, iron staves, and machetes came crashing down upon me from all sides. completely blocking my path. My figure moved rapidly through the narrow, debris-strewn space, weaving between the descending arcs of cold steel with millimeter precision. I didn't even bother to mobilize a single thread of the psionic energy in my body, relying solely on pure physical strength, raw spatial awareness, and top-tier combat techniques to respond to their clumsy, overlapping assaults. A burly, bald man surged forward from my flank, a gleaming machete gripped tightly in his meaty fist as he brought it down in a vicious diagonal slash intended to cleave me in two. I didn't panic. Instead, I simply pivoted smoothly on my left foot, turning my body just enough to let the cold edge of the blade graze past the tip of my nose. I could smell the cheap machine oil on the steel. Before his downward momentum could reset, my left hand shot out like a striking viper, wrapping firmly around the bald man's exposed wrist and snapping it outward with a sudden, devastating twist of my hips. The crisp sound of a clean joint break tore through the air, accompanied by a wet, sickening pop. The bald man's wrist twisted at a grotesque, unnatural angle, his fingers instantly losing all motor control as the heavy machete slipped from his useless grasp. Before he could even begin to scream, I drove my weight forward, using his trapped arm to pull him into a brutal, rising knee strike that smashed dead center into his chin. Fragmented white teeth and bright red blood flew into the air under the sheer force of the impact. His eyes rolled back into his head, his consciousness extinguished instantly, and he collapsed heavily into the mud without making another sound. The sheer efficiency of ultimate combat mastery left absolutely no room for redundant movements or flashy cinematic patterns. Every single strike I delivered was stripped down to pure lethal practicality, targeting vital anatomical points with terrifying economy. Another thug tried to exploit my blind spot, attempting a desperate sneak attack from behind with a rusted pipe. Without even bothering to turn my head to look back, I anchored myself on my left leg and delivered a powerful, blind back kick with my right leg, driving my heel dead center into his advancing knee joint. The structural failure of the bone was immediate, sounding like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot, and it was instantly accompanied by a high-pitched, shrill scream of pure agony. The man fell directly to his knees in the filth, clutching his completely twisted, broken leg as he rolled frantically on the wet ground, trying to crawl away from me. To my left, a man panicked, his hands shaking as he raised a tactical submachine gun, desperately trying to bring the muzzle to bear on me before I could close the distance. My figure blurred as I closed the distance before his finger could even tighten on the trigger mechanism. My left hand shot upward, gripping the cold steel barrel of the submachine gun with an iron grip to force it toward the ceiling, while simultaneously using his forward momentum against him to deliver a brutal, unyielding headbutt straight to the bridge of his nose. The distinct, hollow sound of the nasal bone shattering into fragments was loud enough to make anyone's heart turn completely cold. He collapsed instantly like a marionette, with its strings cut, clutching his face as dark blood welled through his fingers. Screams of agony and panicked shouts rose and fell in a chaotic rhythm throughout the damp, dark alleyway. The spectating black market vendors, who had long since scrambled into the safety of the deep corners and crumbling doorways, watched with wide, disbelieving eyes at the young man standing in the center of the mud, methodically dismantling an entire gang using only one functional hand. In this ruthless underground world that followed nothing but the raw law of the jungle, these scavengers and criminals had seen plenty of vicious, bloodthirsty fighters. Yet, this clean, cold, and utterly lethal martial arts suppression made an involuntary chill run straight down their spines. The confrontation had completely ceased to be a gang fight. It had turned into a one-sided martial arts slaughterhouse. I wove rapidly through the shrinking crowd, my movements calculated down to the millimeter. My spatial awareness was so absolute that every minor dodge, every tilt of my shoulders, perfectly evaded a lethal weapon arc, ensuring that not even the tattered corner of my tactical clothes was touched by their blades. A thug tried to slip behind me, swinging a jagged dagger toward my lower back. Without even bothering to turn my head, my left leg snapped backward in a high arc, my heel accurately colliding with his chin. The massive, concentrated force instantly shattered his mandible, sending a wet crack through the alley. He couldn't even manage a groan before falling backward into a deep coma. Immediately after, my left hand clenched into a tight fist, driving hard into the temple of the final charging lackey on my left. His eyes instantly rolled back into his skull, and his body toppled over stiffly into the mud. In less than 30 seconds, the entire front line was completely erased. Only heavy, ragged breathing and shrill, desperate wails remained in the alleyway. Over a dozen Black Tiger Gang thugs lay scattered across the wet ground, either with broken arms or shattered legs. Not a single one was left standing. Dark blood mixed with the foul sewage, flowing slowly over the pitted concrete. The vendors and scavengers, hiding in the deep shadows, held their breath, their bodies completely frozen in shock. The way they looked at me had completely changed. The casual indifference was replaced by a raw, paralyzing dread. Disabling over a dozen seasoned Black Tiger Gang members with a single hand. This was definitely the undeniable trademark strength of a high-level awakened. Li Hu stood exactly where he was at the back of the alley, the cruel, sadistic grin on his face frozen solid. The heavy chainsaw mounted on his mechanical prosthetic arm was still idling, casting a low, vibrating drone through the silence, but his entire arm was shaking uncontrollably. This was completely impossible. His mind refused to accept the reality unfolding right before his eyes. How could that F-rank piece of trash, the same helpless orphan they had handled, completely at their own whim in the dark corners of the sewers, possess such terrifying, lethal skill? He slowly looked up, his trembling gaze meeting my eyes. I stared back at him with a gaze completely devoid of any emotional fluctuation, cold and flat, as if I were looking at an insignificant ant crawling through the dirt. Li Hu's heart clenched violently with a sudden, suffocating panic. A dark realization began to piece itself together in his mind. Wang Biao had personally taken over a dozen of the gang's absolute best fighters out into the dangerous wilderness zone for the sole purpose of hunting me down. So many days had passed since then, and not a single one of those men had returned or sent word. Yet here I was, standing in front of him entirely alive and unscathed. A terrifying, undeniable thought exploded in Li Hu's mind like a bomb. Wang Biao was dead. He had died out there in the wastes, slaughtered at the hands of this very youth. Pure, unadulterated fear instantly swallowed what little remained of Li Hu's sanity. He let out a strange, high-pitched cry of terror, turned completely on his heel, and ran. To hell with maintaining his status as the Black Tiger Gang leader, and to hell with seeking revenge for his men. The only thing that mattered to him now was the primitive, desperate urge to keep breathing. But the massive, uncalibrated weight of his mechanical prosthetic arm severely dragged down his speed. He ran stumbling and weaving across the uneven ground, panicking so severely that he even began crawling on all fours through the filth to gain traction. "Did I say you could leave?" My voice rang out through the narrow alleyway, flat and cold, entirely devoid of any human warmth. I didn't waste steps chasing him. Instead, I simply flicked the toe of my left boot beneath a bloody machete lying on the ground, sending the heavy blade soaring up into the air before me. Before it could descend, my left leg suddenly exerted explosive power, snapping forward in a vicious kick that struck the hilt dead center. The machete whipped up a sharp gust of wind, cutting through the damp air so fast, it became nothing more than a silver blur. The sound of the sharp blade cutting through flesh was sickeningly clear. The flying machete pierced completely through Li Hu's left thigh, the massive kinetic force carrying his entire heavy body forward as he collapsed face first into the filth. He fell heavily to the ground, his cheek scraping a long, bloody trail across the rough concrete surface. He clutched the gaping wound on his thigh tightly with both hands, bright red blood gushing wildly through his fingers as he let out a shrill scream like a slaughtered pig. I walked up to his writhing form, my footsteps slow and deliberate, and looked down at him. Without a word, I raised my right foot and stepped directly on his chest, pinning his weight to the damp earth. "Lord Lin, Grandpa Lin, spare me." Ignoring the sharp pain in his thigh, Li Hu desperately hugged my ankle with both hands, weeping and snotting onto my boot. "I was wrong. I was blind. Please just let me go like a fart." "Lord Lin?" The title changed quickly enough. I sneered inwardly at his pathetic display. To deal with this kind of trash, who bullied the weak and feared the strong, They would only behave if you made them feel absolute, unforgettable pain. I ignored his frantic pleas for mercy, applying a little pressure with my foot. Another rib broke with a sharp crack. "Where is the shop with the white bone wind chimes?" My voice was indifferent, showing no emotional ups or downs as I stared into his terrified eyes. Lihu gasped in agony, nodding repeatedly as he spoke. I'll say. It's at the northernmost part of the black market. Go through the scrap area, turn left at the third intersection, the iron shack at the very end." That's the one. Before he could finish, I flicked my toe and kicked him hard in the temple. His eyes rolled back, his head slammed into the ground, and he passed out completely. I didn't look at the group of groaning thugs again, stepping over his body and walking straight into the depths of the black market. The sharp pain in my right arm was becoming more intense, the dark red poison lines pulsing as they reached the edge of my shoulder. The nether corpse chi was frantically devouring my strength. I needed to find that poison master immediately. Leaving the groaning remnants of the Black Tiger gang behind, I navigated deeper into the crumbling underbelly of the subterranean market, eventually crossing into the desolate, sparsely populated scrap area. The ambient light grew dimmer with every step, the flickering overhead bulbs giving way to a heavy, oppressive gloom. Massive piles of scrapped mechanical components, rusted remains of armored vehicles, and twisted structural steel lined both sides of the narrow pathway like silent monuments to a forgotten era. The air here smelled less like human filth and more like oxidized iron, stale chemical lubricants, and damp earth. My internal map counted down the distance. I passed the second intersection, reached the third, and made a sharp left turn into an alleyway that immediately hit a dead end. At the very end of this claustrophobic passage, a dilapidated iron shack stood alone. Hanging directly from the rusted tin roof was a string of wind chimes, constructed entirely from the bleached skulls of unknown small beasts. There was absolutely no wind down here in this stagnant vault, yet the horrific chimes were moving, making a dull, hollow clashing sound as the bone surfaces collided. A strong, pungent smell of heavy, concentrated medicine seeped out from the dark cracks in the doorframe, a stench so thick and overwhelming that it almost entirely masked the surrounding odors of rot and rust. The venom in my arm flared again, a sharp spike of heat that confirmed I was in the right place. I walked directly to the door, my left hand extended. Without bothering to knock or announce my presence, I placed my palms flat against the rusted iron door handle and pushed forward with a sudden burst of weight. The heavy iron door let out a piercing, high-pitched grinding sound as it slowly opened inward, exposing the interior to the dim light of the alleyway. The moment the frame cleared, my eyes adjusted to absolute darkness. No internal furnishings, layout, or movement could be seen. But I didn't need my eyes. Without a single word of warning, a faint, incredibly sharp sound of something breaking through the air rang out from the pitch-black void within. A flying needle, its surface gleaming with an entirely deep blue venomous luster, tore through the darkness. With lethal velocity, heading straight on a trajectory for the vital point dead center between my eyebrows. My reflexes, honed by survival and the underlying martial mastery within my nervous system, flared instantly. I stepped back half a pace with my left foot, dropping my center of gravity while my neck muscles suddenly exerted violent force, tilting my head sharply to the right side. The deep blue needle brushed past my temple by a mere hair's breadth, bringing a sharp, freezing wind that chilled my skin before slamming heavily into the rusted iron door behind me, its vibrating tail end making a high-pitched humming sound as it anchored deep into the metal sheets. An old, shrill laugh echoed from the deep darkness of the room, sending a shuddering vibration through the cramped air. "To be able to catch this old man's probing needle, you have some skill," the raspy voice remarked with a layer of mockery. "Come in." Suddenly, a harsh, buzzing, incandescent light flickered on above, stabbing my eyes with its pale radiance. As my vision cleared, the horrific reality of the tin shack lay exposed before me. The internal space was incredibly cramped, with rusted iron racks embedded tightly into all four walls, densely packed from floor to ceiling with murky glass containers. Inside those jars, disembodied arthropod limbs, pale internal organs, and even the severed half of a human head soaked in unknown, Bubbling medicinal liquids gleamed with a sickening luster under the bare bulb. In the far corner of the room lay a tangled pile of unprocessed monster remains, rotting flesh exposed to the air. The overpowering stench of decay, mixed with the heavy chemical smell of medicine, assaulted my nostrils, making my throat tighten. Right in the center of the room, a scrawny old man sat cross-legged on a rough beast-hide mat. His silver hair was a wild, tangled mess that fell over his shoulders, and directly before him sat a heavy brass tripod furnace, with thick purple smoke rolling continuously out of its roaring mouth. The old man's eyes were cloudy and filmed over with age, yet deep within those pupils shone a daunting, sharp brightness that felt like two cold blades cutting into my presence. I didn't utter a single word of greeting. I simply raised my left hand, holding the dark gold stag beetle coin between my fingertips, and flicked it out with a sharp motion. The coin traced a perfect, gleaming arc through the purple smoke, and the old man raised his withered hand to catch it steadily between his fingers. His rough, calloused thumb rubbed deliberately over the stag beetle pattern etched into the gold, and he let out a dry, rattling sneer. "Old Man Do certainly has a lot of face. Sending people to me every few days," he muttered, tossing the coin onto the mat. But as soon as the words left his mouth, his cloudy gaze suddenly sharpened into two pinpricks of light, locking directly onto my drooping, useless right arm. His expression hardened instantly as he read the damage under my skin. Nether corpse chi. The old man didn't even bother to stand up, naming the lethal poison just by looking at the color of my flesh. He stared intently at the spreading dark red poison lines, letting out a sharp cold laugh that rattled the jars on the shelves. "And it's no ordinary nether corpse chi. It's compressed with at least 30 years of the caster's personal cultivation," he said, his voice dropping into a raspy whisper. "Kid, did you aggressively offend that fellow nether burial?" I stepped forward into the room, ignoring the stench, and stood right before his mat. The old man beckoned with a sharp flick of his wrist, signaling me to extend my right arm. I held it out as best I could, the dead weight hanging like lead. Reach into his sleeve, the old man pulled a 3-inch-long silver needle, its surface carved with faint, microscopic lines, and pricked the very edge of the pulsing poison lines near my shoulder. When he pulled the silver needle out, a single heavy drop of grayish-black blood clung to the tip before falling. He had placed a white jade dish underneath to catch it, and the moment the drop struck the surface, an aggressive, violent hissing sound erupted inside the room. A thin wisp of foul-smelling smoke rose into the air. Barely 3 seconds later, fine, jagged cracks spread across the entire surface of the white jade dish, and it shattered into several pieces on the spot, completely corroded by the sheer toxicity. The old man's expression darkened instantly, the mock indifference vanishing from his face as he looked up at me. "Did you use some kind of high-grade detoxification potion before you came here?" "Fountain of life," I nodded, my voice remaining flat despite the throbbing pain. The old man suddenly slapped his thigh in a fit of rage and cursed loudly, his silver hair shaking. "You absolute fool. An A-rank detoxification potion contains incredibly high concentrations of pure life energy. The corpse chi greedily devoured that energy to fuel its own growth, and the erosion speed has completely doubled. Normally, with your constitution, you'd have 6 full days to live, but now you have 3 days at the absolute most." The old man held up 3 withered, shaking fingers and waved them aggressively right before my eyes. "Once those 3 days pass, your brain nerves will be completely hollowed out by the rot, and you'll turn into nothing more than a mindless walking corpse under Nether Burial's direct command." My expression tightened slightly, the reality of the clock ticking down sinking in. I looked directly into his cloudy pupils. "Can it be cured?" The old man looked me up and down, sizing up my posture, my silence, and the lack of fear in my expression. He remained quiet for a long, heavy moment, then slowly retracted one of his fingers, leaving only 2 standing upright before my face. "2 conditions," he said, his voice dropping into a raspy, serious register. "First, I need 3 A-rank psionic cores to use as a medicinal catalyst for the furnace. Without that raw energy to burn away the rot, my medicine won't even scratch the surface." I didn't utter a word of complaint. I simply flipped my left hand, accessing my storage space, and let 3 A-rank psionic cores drop onto the beast-hide mat right in front of him. They hit the leather with a soft thud, emitting a brilliant, high-purity golden light that briefly pushed back the purple smoke and illuminated the dark corners of the shack. There was absolutely no hesitation in my movement. A flash of genuine surprise crossed the old man's cloudy eyes, his fingers twitching as he looked at the pristine cores. But he immediately recovered his composure and continued. The second condition is entirely on you. During the detoxification process, the compressed corpse chi will realize it's being cornered and will make a final, frantic counterattack. The physical pain will be equivalent to having every single one of your meridians ripped out of your flesh alive and then forced back in with red-hot iron. You must remain absolutely, completely conscious throughout the entire process. The very second your consciousness breaks, or you look for the sweet relief of fainting, the corpse chi will instantly take advantage of the structural opening in your mental defenses and completely devour your brainstem. The old man raised a single withered finger and tapped his own temple hard. If your focus slips for even a millisecond, the poison floods the brainstem instantly. Even a god descending from the heavens couldn't save you then. He paused, his gaze turning incredibly cold, trying to weigh my resolve. I have practiced medicine in the darkest corners of this world for 40 years, and I've seen many powerful men afflicted with nether corpse chi. Not a single one of them dared to endure the raw fury of the corpse chi's counterattack while remaining fully conscious. In the end, faced with that level of torture, they all chose to end their own lives rather than face it. I didn't give him an answer in words. I simply gripped the cold zipper of my tactical suit with my left hand and ripped it down in one smooth, aggressive motion. I completely exposed my right arm to the stagnant air of the shack, offering the damage up to his gaze without a trace of hesitation. The dark red poison lines had already aggressively clawed their way to the absolute edge of my shoulder, and the veins running beneath the skin were bulging high, showing an eerie, pulsing purple-black color that looked like a living entity trying to break out of my flesh. I looked flatly at the old man, my voice entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Begin," I said simply. The old man stared directly into my eyes for a full, heavy 3 seconds, searching for even a microscopic tremor of panic or regret. But my gaze remained as cold and flat as a frozen lake. A sudden, wild grin split his wrinkled face, and he tilted his head back, letting out a loud, shrill laugh that made the tin roof rattle above our heads. "Good. Splendid," he shouted, slapping his thigh with a wet thud. "I absolutely like madmen like you who aren't afraid of a horrific death." The old man scrambled to his feet with surprising agility, his withered hands moving across the iron racks on the walls to snatch 7 glass bottles, each containing a different hue of thick, bubbling medicinal liquid and preserved insect carcasses. He aggressively popped the corks one by one, pouring the dark, foul contents directly into the boiling brass furnace before him. The purple smoke surging out of the furnace's mouth instantly turned violent, turning a deep, toxic green as the ambient temperature in the room dropped sharply toward the freezing point. Without losing a second, he picked up the 3 A-rank psionic cores from the mat. Holding a specially made, long silver needle in his right hand, his fingers became a blur as he quickly carved miniature, glowing array patterns onto the hard surfaces of the cores. The very millisecond the final lines formed, the immense high-purity psionic energy locked inside the cores was violently forced out, liquefying under the pressure and dripping down into the furnace as a brilliant, golden liquid energy. As the golden liquid hit the toxic brew, a violent, chaotic boiling sound erupted from deep within the brass tripod, purple smoke and golden light intertwining in a wild dance. A few agonizing minutes later, the old man tipped the furnace forward, pouring a thick, dark green sludge into a crude earthenware bowl. "Drink it all down," he commanded, thrusting the steaming bowl toward my face, his cloudy eyes boring into mine. "This stuff will aggressively lure the hidden corpse chi out from the very depths of your meridians, forcing it to the surface of your skin. Once it gathers there, I will use my needles to seal your acupoints and violently drive it out of your body. But remember, no matter how much it burns, you must not lose focus or faint." I reached out with my left hand to take the heavy earthenware bowl, my grip steady despite the violent heat radiating from the thick fluid. At the exact millisecond our fingers brushed, my gaze swept calmly over the shriveled, spotted skin on the back of the old man's left hand. On that shriveled surface, half hidden by a smear of dried soot, sat a very small, intricate black tattoo. It was the depiction of a single closed eye. The memory of the blood-red vertical pupil from Liu Zhenjiang's secret letter flashed instantly through my mind like a stroke of lightning. The pattern itself was slightly different, but that specific, obscure, and gloomy aura emanating from the ink was exactly the same. I withdrew my gaze instantly, keeping my face flat and expressionless, burying this vital detail deep within the dark corners of my heart, without asking a single question. I raised the earthenware bowl to my lips, tilted my head back, and drained the dark green liquid in one single aggressive swallow. The moment the fluid entered my throat, it felt bone-chillingly cold, like swallowing liquid ice, carrying a sharp, biting sensation that scraped down my esophagus directly into my stomach. But the icy sensation lasted for only a heartbeat. The very next second, a violent explosive heat wave detonated from deep within my abdomen, crashing through my meridians across my entire body with the force of a tidal wave. I let out a muffled groan, the veins on my forehead instantly bulging high beneath the skin as the dark red poison lines on my right arm began to twist and ripple violently like living worms. Beneath my flesh, countless tiny grayish-black threads were being forcibly yanked from the deepest recesses of my meridians by the sheer power of the medicinal liquid, surging frantically toward the surface of my skin. An intense, blinding agony swept through my entire physical form. It wasn't the clean pain of a blade cutting through flesh. It felt as if millions of microscopic insects were greedily gnawing at the very marrow inside the gaps of my bones. I gritted my teeth together so hard that my jaw ached, my left hand clutching the rough wooden board beneath the beast hide, mat with such an iron grip that sharp wood splinters pierced deep into my fingertips, drawing small beads of blood. I gasped heavily for air, cold sweat instantly soaking the fabric on my back. The old man held a silver needle, his attention entirely focused on the rapidly shifting poison lines on my arm, preparing to seal the acupoints. But just as the medicine reached its absolute peak, my vision suddenly flickered with a violent glitch. The system panel popped up automatically in my field of view, but the familiar light blue screen was completely gone, now covered in a piercing, flashing blood-red glare that filled my eyes. Severe warning. Detected that the nether corpse chi in the host's body is producing a resonance reaction with an unknown energy. Resonance source locked, host's soul core region. Warning. The corpse chi erosion path has deviated. It has left the surface gathering orbit and is concentrating toward the soul core. The bold text burned into my eyes, and my pupils suddenly contracted to the size of pinpricks. At the exact same millisecond, the silver needle held firmly in the old man's hand jolted violently, as if struck by an invisible hammer. The high-purity psionic light spots attached to the needle tip flickered frantically, sputtering out chaotic sparks as the originally stable acupoint sealing feedback became completely unraveled and chaotic. The old man's face changed drastically, the deep wrinkles on his forehead twisting in sheer disbelief. He stood up abruptly from his beast-hide mat, his once cloudy, filmed-over eyes now stretched wide and round, staring fixedly at the terrifying transformation occurring on my right arm. Not only were the dark red poison lines failing to rise to the surface of my skin as the medicine intended, but they were also actively retracting back into the deeper muscular layers, vanishing from the surface at a speed visible to the naked eye. This isn't right. This is completely impossible. The old man's raspy voice trembled violently, with a sudden unconcealable horror that echoed off the cramped tin walls. This corpse chi, it's completely ignoring the physical anchor. It's not going toward the surface at all. It's actively boring straight into your soul. He stumbled back a step, his breath hitching in his throat, as the purple smoke swirled chaotically around his shaking form. Gritting his teeth, he forced out his next words one heavy syllable at a time, staring at me as if looking at a ghost. Just what on earth? What kind of terrifying secret is hidden inside your body? The light in the room seemed to dim as my internal nervous system began to tear itself apart, the insidious black tide driving deeper into my core, completely out of the old man's reach. The thick, dark green medicinal liquid did not work as the old man had predicted. The nether corpse chi had broken past all physical boundaries and gone completely out of control. The dark red poison patterns abruptly stopped their upward climb toward the surface of my skin, plunging inward instead. This insidious, rotten energy began to collapse into itself rapidly, condensing the sprawling grayish-black, poisonous stream into a single, solid black line of pure malice that pierced directly through my physical meridians. My biological defenses were entirely powerless against this concentrated soul-seeking poison, and my meridians began shattering inch by inch as the black line drove straight ahead, smashing through my mental barriers like glass. It whipped up a monstrous, toxic wave in my sea of consciousness, charging directly at my absolute soul core. Outside, my physical body suddenly went rigid as iron, my eyes instantly losing all focus as my pupils dilated rapidly into blank pools. An intense, suffocating pain that tore far beyond ordinary physical limits acted directly upon my central nervous system. My left hand gripped the rough animal skin mat beneath me with white-knuckled desperation, my fingernails slicing through the heavy leather and sinking deep into the solid wooden floorboard below. Sharp wood splinters stabbed straight into the bleeding gaps between my fingers, but my mind was completely oblivious to the physical world. I could no longer hear the old man's panicked voice or feel the cramped tin shack. My entire consciousness had fallen into a deathly silent, pitch-black void realm. This was the absolute depth of my sea of consciousness. There was no light here, no ambient sound, only an endless, freezing vacuum. I looked down at my own soul form, horrified to see that thousands of grayish-black threads were already tightly entwined around my spiritual body, like living, parasitic vines. These foul tendrils burrowed frantically into every gap of my soul form, and with every inch they forced their way inside, a massive portion of my raw mental energy was greedily devoured. Not far ahead, the thick, rolling corpse chi gathered together, condensing into a pale, distorted phantom face that stared at me with dead eyes. The psionic mark that nether burial had left inside the lethal toxin fully revived at this exact millisecond, vibrating with a malicious sentience. It was no longer content with merely destroying my physical body from the outside. It intended to completely occupy this empty shell, turning my own flesh into its weapon. The pale phantom opened its distorted mouth, letting out a hoarse, echoing mockery that vibrated through the silent vacuum of my mind. "Give up, boy. Your base mental energy is far too weak to withstand my presence," the voice hissed, a smug certainty rippling across its smoky features. "Be a good, quiet boy and become my nourishment. I will use your pristine physical body to turn the entirety of Xinjiang City into a silent dead zone." As the phantom spoke, the grayish-black parasitic threads tightened their grip around my soul form, constricting with an agonizing pressure that tried to systematically dismantle my sanity and force me into oblivion. The edges of my conscious mind began to blur and fray, a seductive numbness creeping in, urging me to let go and sink into the darkness. But as I stared at that pale, distorted face floating in my own mind, a cold, vicious sneer tugged at the corner of my spiritual mouth. "Want to blindly devour me? Aren't you afraid of completely shattering your rotten teeth on my core?" I didn't try to pull back or escape, knowing there was nowhere to run within my own skull. Instead, I made a calculated, dangerous choice. I voluntarily gave up all standard spiritual defenses, allowing the parasitic threads to swarm forward, while I forcibly compressed and condensed every single shred of my remaining conscious thoughts into one localized point. Relying on absolute willpower, I molded my scattered, fraying mental energy into a single, jagged, and incredibly sharp mental spike. It was a weapon forged from pure survival instinct. I seized absolute control of that spiritual spike and stabbed it directly into the thickest cluster of grayish-black threads wrapped around my chest. Every single time my condensed consciousness spike severed one of those foul, grayish-black threads, a blinding, tearing wave of spiritual pain echoed from the absolute deepest recesses of my soul. It felt as though a piece of my core identity was being violently hacked away along with the parasite, yet I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. I gritted my spiritual teeth and swung the consciousness spike frantically, pouring every ounce of my remaining focus into a brutal, calculated defense. I was gambling everything on this moment. Gambling that my raw willpower was fundamentally tougher than this rotten poison, and that my life wouldn't break before Nether Burial's seal did. The pale phantom face in front of me widened its eyes in sudden shock, realizing that instead of panicking, I was systematically carving through its network of corruption. The smug certainty vanished from its distorted features, replaced by a frantic, aggressive urgency as it commanded the remaining threads to swarm my core all at once. The black tide rose, pressing down upon my mind with a suffocating weight that threatened to snuff out my spark permanently. At the exact moment my soul power was about to run completely dry, when the jagged spike of my consciousness began to splinter under the sheer pressure of the corruption, a low tectonic vibration rolled out from the deepest, uncharted part of my sea of consciousness. The silent, pitch-black void realm cracked open without a single word of warning, splitting wide like a canyon. A beam of extremely pure, blindingly brilliant silver-white light poured out from the center of that crack, cutting through the darkness with absolute authority. The distinct, unyielding aura of this light was instantly familiar. It was the exact same primordial energy that had entered my body during the ancient temple legacy bestowal. It had always been lurking quietly in the depths of my soul, entirely unaffected by my physical injuries, never disturbing my day-to-day survival. Only at this exact moment, when my soul itself faced total, absolute destruction, did it finally choose to awaken and respond. The very millisecond that pure silver-white light touched the encroaching nether corpse chi, the transformation was immediate and total. The thousands of grayish-black threads that had been aggressively constricting my soul form let out sharp, echoing shrieks of agony, rolling back frantically as if scorched by an open flame. They had met their true, primordial natural enemy, an absolute suppression of rank that brooked no resistance. Nether Burial's phantom face distorted into a grotesque mask of horror, letting out an extremely unwilling, echoing roar as the silver radiance pierced through its smoky eyes. Before it could even attempt to restructure its presence, the phantom shattered violently into a million harmless fragments under the spreading silver light, its hold on my mind completely obliterated. Simultaneously, a clean blue light screen popped up within the conscious space, overriding the previous red warnings. Detected dormant, inheritance mark energy in the host's soul core area. The energy has been activated by an external invasion and is performing autonomous purification. The silver-white light instantly filled the entire expanse of my sea of consciousness, washing away every single trace of the dark, stagnant shadow. Under its gentle yet unyielding illumination, the remaining nether corpse chi burned and evaporated rapidly, turning into thin, harmless mist before vanishing entirely. The threads parasitizing my soul form snapped inch by inch, dissolving into absolute nothingness. A deeply soothing, warm energy enveloped my tattered spiritual body, and the lost mental energy began to slowly recover, flowing back into my core like a calm river. Outside, inside the cramped iron shack, the physical changes were just as dramatic. The old man widened his cloudy, filmed-over eyes to their absolute limit, staring fixedly at my resting right arm in sheer disbelief. The originally hideous, boiling dark red poison patterns were receding at a speed visible to the naked eye, pulling back toward my fingers. The skin where the poison patterns faded instantly regained its original healthy color, even emitting a layer of lustrous, clean sheen under the bare bulb. A thick, grayish-black mist was being forcibly squeezed out from every single pore on my right arm, making a sharp hissing sound the exact millisecond it touched the air, before dissipating completely into the room. The old man stood completely stunned, his jaws slightly slack as he watched the final wisps of black vapor dissolve into the ambient purple smoke of the furnace. In his 40 long years of practicing medicine across the darkest, most perilous corners of the world, he had seen countless strange poisons, forbidden curses, and incurable illnesses. Yet, in all his days, he had never once witnessed an awakened who was capable of completely purifying the compressed malice of nether corpse chi entirely on their own, especially at the absolute soul level. What shocked his senses even more, causing a visible tremor to run through his frail shoulders, was the faint trace of silver-white energy leaking through my pores. The psionic energy wielded by modern awakenids, regardless of whether they belong to the elemental, combat enhancement, or psychic types, always carried very obvious, distinct elemental or energetic characteristics. But this silver-white energy flowing through my form was different. It had absolutely no elemental attributes, carrying instead an ancient aura that represented an absolute, crushing suppression of rank. This was definitely not any known psionic system of the present day. The old man's fingers trembled slightly as he pointed toward my arm. Having lived through decades of upheaval, he had only ever seen a few cryptic, fragmentary words about this specific kind of energy in a handwritten copy of a tattered ancient book he had uncovered in his youth. An ancient inheritance? The old man muttered to himself, his wizened body trembling uncontrollably as the realization settled in his gut. The casual condescension he had maintained since I walked through his door vanished entirely, replaced instantly by a deep, frantic wariness that tightened his posture. Who on earth? Just what kind of monster are you? I didn't answer him right away. I slowly opened my physical eyes, my vision instantly clearing as the remaining red artifacts of the system alert faded from view. I looked straight down at my right arm. The dark red poison lines were completely gone, replaced by a flawless layer of silver white, glimmer that flowed faintly under my skin like liquid stardust before entirely disappearing deep into my flesh after 3 seconds. My physical state felt clearer, lighter, and more synchronized than ever before in my life. The hollow, terrifying weakness of having my life force systematically stripped away by the corpse chi was swept entirely clean. The blue light screen in front of my face refreshed once more, displaying the final calculation. Status: Nether corpse chi has been completely cleared. Extra reward: due to activation, the awakening level of the inheritance mark in the soul core area has increased from 0.1% to 2.3%. Current unlocked permission: soul perception range expansion. I slowly clenched my right fist, feeling the muscle fibers align perfectly, as the small bones in my hand let out a sharp, rhythmic popping sound. The raw strength in my right arm was not only fully and completely restored to its peak operational capacity, but it also felt noticeably more intense and powerful than before I had been poisoned by Nether Burial's strike. However, the most drastic and undeniable transformation had occurred at the subtle level of my baseline senses. The newly unlocked soul perception functioned like an invisible hypersensitive radar, expanding outward from my brainstem. Without even relying on my physical eyes, I could clearly and flawlessly capture the micro-trajectories of every individual drop of boiling medicinal sludge bubbling within the brass furnace across the room. I could map the chaotic swirl of the toxic purple smoke, and I could even perceive the irregular, frantic thumping of the old man's heart as he stood frozen a few paces away. The lethal toxin that Nether Burial had compressed with 30 years of malice had completely failed to hollow out my mind. Instead, it had been forced into becoming the exact catalyst and raw fuel required to jumpstart my dormant inheritance mark. I stood up smoothly from the rough floorboards, casually moving my shoulders to test the fluid integration of my joints, and turned my head to fix my cold gaze directly onto the shaking old man. "The poison is gone," I stated flatly, my voice cutting through the humid air of the shack. The old man rapidly brushed a layer of gray ash and dust off his shriveled hands, aggressively forcing his trembling posture to settle as he fought to suppress the absolute horror threatening to swallow his sanity. His pale, wrinkled expression barely returned to a mask of professional calm, though his heart continued to hammer erratically against his ribs. "Your poison wasn't actually cured by any medicine this old man concocted," he said, shaking his head slowly as he pointed a withered finger at my chest. "It was violently purified by whatever terrifying entity is lurking deep inside your soul. My bowl of dark green medicine was, at the absolute most, a rough catalyst to force the issue." He paused, his cloudy eyes darting down to the 3 pristine A-rank psionic cores resting on the floorboards. With a swift, practiced wave of his heavy sleeve, he pocketed them instantly into his robes, refusing to let the wealth slip away. "However, a deal is a deal, and I'm still taking these 3 cores as my payment." The old man's tone suddenly shifted, his raspy voice dropping into an incredibly serious, muted whisper that made the surrounding jars feel colder. "Kid, if you want to keep your head attached to your shoulders, you'd better hide that bizarre, ancient power of yours deep within your bones. The world out there is changing, and it's full of predators. Once certain high-level people catch even a single microscopic whiff of what you're carrying inside your soul, the horrific trouble you face will be absolutely more terrifying than 10 nether burials combined." I didn't offer a single word of response to his dramatic warning. Instead, I stood motionless, my expanded soul perception locking directly onto the shriveled skin on the back of his left hand. Specifically, I stared at that tiny, intricate black tattoo of the closed eye. My chaotic experience over the past few days, combined with the raw survival instincts honed by ultimate combat mastery, led me to a sharp, decisive internal judgment. Although this scrawny old man's true background and identity remained completely unknown to me, he had, at the very least, done his absolute best to try and stabilize my condition only moments ago, when the corpse chi was tearing my meridians apart. In a city where everyone was trying to chew my flesh, someone who was willing to sincerely try and save. My life was a rare anomaly, and at the very least, worth showing a single card to test his true allegiance. I smoothly flipped my left hand, accessing my storage space, and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper I had uncovered deep inside Liu Zhenxiang's personal storage bracelet. I held it flat against my palm, turned the paper over, and thrust the hand-drawn pattern of a blood-red vertical pupil directly before the old man's cloudy eyes, leaving no room for him to look away. "A closed black eye on your hand, an open blood-red pupil on this paper," I stated, my tone absolutely certain, my cold gaze entirely locked onto every single micro-expression forming on his wrinkled face. "You recognize this symbol. Tell me what it means." The exact millisecond the old man's gaze fell upon that crude sketch of the blood-red vertical pupil, the transformation in his posture was instantaneous and severe. His pupils contracted sharply to the size of pinpricks, and the remaining healthy color in his wrinkled face drained away in a heartbeat, leaving his skin as pale and bloodless as a sheet of paper. The old man suddenly lunged forward, his shriveled hands swinging outward to grab my left wrist with an iron, desperate grip. Despite his frail appearance, his withered fingers exerted a surprising, painful amount of raw physical force that dug deep into my flesh. "Where did you get this paper?" The old man's voice was no longer just raspy. It was heavily tinged with an unmistakable, paralyzing fear that made his breathing rattle violently in his chest. I looked down at his trembling, claw-like hand clutching my wrist, my face completely expressionless, and chose not to give him an immediate answer. My silence seemed to speak volumes. The old man took a deep, ragged breath, suddenly releasing his grip as if he had been violently shocked by a live electrical wire, and stumbled back 2 steps until his back hit his crowded medicine shelves. His wide, terrified gaze moved frantically back and forth between the blood-red vertical pupil drawn on my paper and the closed-eye tattoo etched into the back of his own left hand. The Blood Eye Society. The old man squeezed out those 4 words in a hoarse, bone-dry whisper that sounded like dead leaves scraping across concrete. How could they possibly appear inside Xinjiang City? These extreme lunatics should have been completely wiped out of existence by the Federation military forces decades ago. He paused, his heavy Adam's apple bobbing up and down violently as he swallowed his panic. If the thing drawn on this scrap of paper is real, if they are truly operating here in the dark, then everyone alive in this entire city will die a horrific death. My brow furrowed slightly at his ominous words, and I opened my mouth, about to aggressively demand a full explanation of their goals. Kua la la la. Suddenly, without a single word of warning, a chaotic noise erupted from the alley outside. The string of bone wind chimes hanging directly under the tattered iron eaves began to shake and rattle violently. There was absolutely no wind blowing through the narrow, suffocating underground passage, yet the small beast skulls emitted an extremely rapid, piercing, and frantic clashing sound that echoed like a death knell. Not only that, but the heavy glass containers resting on the iron racks inside the room began to vibrate and chatter against each other, the severed limbs soaking in pale medicines, tossing up and down within the turbid fluid. The ambient temperature in the air instantly plummeted straight down to the freezing point, frosting our breath. The old man's pale face turned from a bloodless white to a sickly, mottled green, and he suddenly spun his body around to look directly at the closed iron door. "Someone's coming," the old man whispered, his voice incredibly tight and strained as his right hand quietly reached down for the heavy cloth pouch resting at his waist. "And it's far more than just one person." The frantic clashing of the bone wind chimes reached a deafening crescendo before abruptly cutting out. The heavy, rusted iron door of the shack didn't just swing open. It imploded inward under a sudden burst of massive, crushing physical power, its twisted metal sheets ripping away from the hinges and embedding themselves deep into the concrete walls on both sides. The barrier was completely gone. Through the settling dust, 3 dark figures materialized within the narrow underground alleyway outside, blocking the exit entirely. The figure standing at the very front was tall, unnaturally thin, and completely shrouded in a tattered dark coat. His face was entirely concealed beneath a deathly pale, elongated bird beak mask that gleamed with an artificial porcelain finish. Right upon the forehead of that mask, a striking, blood-red vertical pupil was intricately painted, matching the crude sketch in my hand with absolute terrifying precision. Flanking him on either side stood 2 heavy awakenids completely clad in reinforced black tactical suits, their faces obscured by dark visors. These 2 guardians exuded a dense, oppressive energetic aura, their raw psionic fluctuations vibrating at a frequency that far exceeded those of the clumsy black tiger gang thugs I had dismantled earlier. My newly expanded senses flagged them instantly. These were highly trained, cold-blooded combat experts of at least level 30. The birdbeak masked man slowly tilted his head, his hidden eyes bypassing my presence entirely as he locked his focus onto the trembling old man standing behind me. "Senior Poison Master, it has been a full, long 20 years since we last crossed paths," the masked man remarked, his high-pitched voice carrying a disturbing, feminine cadence that vibrated uncomfortably in the cramped room. "As a dirty defector who boldly turned his back on the Blood-Eye Society, are you finally prepared to face your execution today?" He paused for a microsecond, his shifting gaze finally sweeping over my form with absolute boredom, as if he were looking at nothing more than an obstructive, insignificant insect that happened to be standing in his way. "As for the pathetic little kid standing next to you, consider it nothing more than his own terrible luck," he added smoothly. "He can simply join you on your long road to the afterlife." The old man's withered body shuddered violently at those words, but the paralyzing fear in his eyes suddenly hardened into a cold, desperate, killing intent. He took a sharp step forward, aggressively using his frail frame to shield me from their line of sight. "Kid, you shouldn't have taken out that damn slip of paper just now." The old man spoke with rapid, hushed urgency, his raspy voice kept extremely low so it wouldn't carry past the threshold. "That thing is an active tracking mark of the Blood-Eye Society. As long as it is exposed to the open air for more than 10 seconds, their hunters can easily follow the lingering spiritual scent to lock onto our exact coordinates." My eyes narrowed as the old man's frantic explanation clicked into place. No wonder that tiny slip of paper had survived Lu Zhenxiang's storage bracelet. It wasn't just a memo, it was an active beacon. The exact millisecond it was exposed to the open air of the black market. We were already clocked. I was once a core poison refiner for the Blood-Eye Society. The Poison Master continued, his eyes locked onto the 3 killers outside without a single blink. "After running and hiding for 20 long years, I suppose my luck has finally run out with these lunatics." The tall man in the bird-beak mask didn't waste another breath conversing. He simply raised his right hand and lightly flicked his pale index finger into the air. It was a casual gesture, but the execution was instant. The 2 black-clad awakenids lunged forward into the cramped room simultaneously. One of them materialized deep, glowing, dark red psionic short blades in both hands, his body carving a straight line for the elderly man. They clearly wanted to neutralize the primary target first. The second assassin grinned maliciously, shifting his weight to circle around my flank. His movement turned into a blurred afterimage as his wrist snapped, throwing 3 poisoned, ghostly blue darts through the air to completely cut off all my potential evasion angles. In their calculation, a teenager with a basic combat stance was nothing more than an insect to be crushed in passing. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. At the exact millisecond the darts left his fingertips, I moved. My left hand reached back, slapping the quick-release mechanism of the weapon case on my back, and the silver soul rifle dropped perfectly into my waiting palm. Simultaneously, my newly awakened soul perception exploded outward, mapping the entire 15-meter radius with absolute clarity. Inside my head, the high-speed assault slowed to a crawl. I could capture the exact rotation angle and aerodynamic arc trajectory of every single poisoned dart spinning through the air toward my face. I could see the shifting muscles of the assassin lunging at the old man. I didn't even bother to look at the projectiles heading my way. I raised the muzzle of Silver Soul, aligning it with cold precision toward the other side of the room, directly at the black-clad man who was putting all his momentum into killing the Poison Master. The heavy gunshots suddenly exploded within the cramped, echoing space of the underground iron shack. A single psionic bullet, wrapped in a faint silver glow, tore through the thick purple smoke and pierced directly into the charging assassin's right shoulder. The black-clad man was caught at the absolute peak of his full-speed dash and had zero time to react or change his trajectory. His shoulder blade was brutally shattered into bone fragments by the massive kinetic energy of the round, and the dark red psionic short blades in his hands instantly dissolved into harmless speckles of fading light. The man screamed in agony as the impact threw him off balance, crashing heavily into a nearby medicine shelf and bringing down a cascade of glass jars. Almost at the exact same millisecond, the 3 poisoned blue darts thrown by the second assassin arrived right in front of my face. Relying on the hyper-focused slow-motion feedback of my soul perception, I tilted my head slightly to the left. The 3 fatal needles grazed past my skin by a hair's breadth, slamming harmlessly into the wooden wall behind me. Without pausing to watch them land, my left wrist flicked with absolute mechanical precision, shifting the muzzle of Silver Soul to the left to lock onto the second target. The second gunshot rang out, a deafening blast that filled the room. The bullet hit the second assassin squarely in the center of his chest. The sheer, concentrated power of the impact knocked him entirely off his feet, blasting a bowl-sized hole directly through the reinforced tactical suit on his chest. The black-clad man didn't even have time to let out a final wail before his body hit the floor, dead on impact. From the exact millisecond, the 2 assassins had lunged into the shack, to the moment they were both completely dealt with. Less than 5 seconds had passed. The interior of the tin-roofed house fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. The bird-beak masked man's posture froze completely in the doorway. He had watched with his own eyes as his 2 level 30 subordinates, seasoned killers who had survived dozens of covert operations, were cleanly, efficiently, and ruthlessly taken down by 2 precise shots from a boy he hadn't even considered a threat a few moments ago. That absolute grasp of split-second combat opportunities, that bone-chilling composure under fire. These were simply not attributes someone of this young age should possess. The masked man remained entirely silent for 2 heavy seconds, the pale porcelain beak of his mask catching the dim incandescent light. "Interesting," he finally said. His voice was no longer carrying that high-pitched, feminine cadence from before. It had turned into an extremely cold, raspy rumble that made the air vibrate. "I completely misjudged you, kid. To possess such terrifying strength at such a young age. What an absolute pity." Before the final word could even leave his mouth, a suffocating, gargantuan psionic pressure violently erupted from his thin body. The sudden spike in energy was so immense that the remaining glass containers inside the tin-roofed house began to shatter one after another, spraying thick medicinal liquids and pickled specimens all over the floorboards. This was a terrifying absolute power that only a level 40 advanced awakened could emit. The masked man made a sharp grasping motion with his right hand, and a massive blood-red phantom eye quickly condensed in the cramped air above his head. That eye possessed no eyelid and no white, consisting entirely of a murky, swirling crimson that stared fixedly down at my position. An invisible mental shockwave crushed down upon my mind like a towering tsunami. I felt a sudden, tearing pain erupt deep within my brain, and my vision was instantly filled with a blinding, monochromatic blood-red glare. My physical body lost all control under the sheer energetic weight. My legs gave way, and I fell heavily onto one knee, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. It was a direct, crushing suppression on the absolute soul level. "Die," the masked man muttered coldly, closing his shriveled fingers. At the exact millisecond, the crushing blood-red eye was about to completely shatter my consciousness. The poison master moved with a frantic, explosive energy. He violently kicked over the heavy brass tripod furnace sitting in front of him, sending the residual dark green venom at the bottom pooling into a pressurized water arrow that flew straight toward the masked man's face. At the exact same time, the old man bit the tip of his tongue hard, spitting a thick mouthful of essence. Blood, directly onto the closed-eye tattoo, etched into the shriveled skin on the back of his left hand. The black tattoo absorbed the crimson essence blood instantly, and that tightly closed eye eerily and violently forced itself open, revealing a miniature, wriggling iris. A poison backlash. The poison master let out a shrill, skin-crawling roar that tore through his vocal cords. An extremely dense, billowing circle of dark green poison mist erupted violently from every single pore of his shriveled body, instantly filling the entire interior of the cramped iron shack. The immense volume of the toxic gas forced the bird-beak masked man to cut off his mental soul attack prematurely. He retreated violently toward the alley, his hands snapping upward to raise a solid blood-red psionic shield directly in front of his face. The dark green poison mist collided with the barrier, making a fierce, sizzling, corrosive sound as it tried to chew through the energy. The black-clad assassin, whose shoulder blade had been shattered earlier, was still groaning on the floor. He had nowhere to hide from the expansion. The exact millisecond he inhaled the stray green tendrils of the mist, his exposed skin rapidly began to fester, blistering and turning to liquid before my eyes. Without even having enough time to scream, his entire physical form dissolved into a foul-smelling, bubbling pool of bloody water on the floorboards. The crushing mental pressure suffocating my brain suddenly vanished into nothingness. I gasped heavily for air, the thick veins on my forehead bulging wildly against my skin as I forced my body to stand upright once more. The pure silver-white light deep within my soul core spontaneously lit up, forming a microscopic translucent film across my lungs. The exact millisecond, the poison mist invaded my body, sealing out the dark green toxins completely and keeping my system pristine. The poison master had aggressively used almost his entire lifetime's cultivation and every single shred of his remaining mental energy to release this final technique, buying me the only possible opening to strike back. I suddenly looked up, my expanded soul perception, piercing effortlessly through the thick, swirling green poison mist to lock onto the masked man's exact position outside the threshold. I raised Silver Soul, my left hand steady as stone. Suddenly, the pure silver-white light hidden deep within my soul core surged violently through my meridians and into my arm, pouring directly into the mechanical body of the weapon. On the surface of Silver Soul's dark gray barrel, a complex and ancient network of geometric silver-white patterns lit up with a blinding radiance. Inheritance mark energy resonated with the legacy weapon, Silver Soul. Current projectile added with one ancient purification effect. My eyes turned cold and sharp as my index finger pulled the trigger hard. Bang! The mechanical sound of the shot had completely changed. It was no longer a muffled gunpowder explosion, but a clear, high-pitched hum that resonated in the ears. A brilliant projectile trailing a magnificent silver-white flame tore through the thick poison mist, leaving a perfectly straight vacuum channel in the air where the green gas was utterly obliterated. The birdbeak masked man's hidden pupils suddenly contracted to the size of pinpricks. He felt it. He felt that the primordial energy wrapped inside that glowing projectile was more than enough to take his life in an instant. He frantically pushed the remaining psionic energy in his body to its absolute limits, reinforcing his blood-red shield to its thickest, most durable state. The silver-white projectile slammed directly into the center of the blood-red shield. The exact millisecond the crimson energy touched the silver-white purification light. It behaved like fresh snow meeting boiling water, instantly melting, cracking, and collapsing inward. The power of ancient purification possessed absolute, unyielding restraint over this kind of dark, forbidden blood energy. The projectile pierced straight through the ruined barrier, grazing the masked man's right forearm, and violently tearing away a large chunk of flesh before finally shattering the solid brick wall far behind him. The masked man let out a sharp, muffled groan of pure agony, his lean body staggering backward into the dark alleyway. The impact was so severe that the pale porcelain bird beak mask covering his face was caught directly in the expanding silver shockwave. It split open with a loud crack down the center line, pieces breaking away to reveal half of a pale, distorted human face, twisted in a mixture of unadulterated shock and fury. Clutching his blood-drenched, torn right arm with his left hand, his breathing came in frantic, ragged gasps as he stared intently at me through the settling dust. The arrogance and utter contempt that had filled his demeanor only moments ago had completely vanished, replaced now by a deep, frantic wariness and a flickering edge of absolute madness. An ancient inheritance. It's actually an ancient inheritance hidden inside you. The masked man's voice was hoarse and cracking. Suddenly realizing something, his single exposed eye widened, and he growled with a feverish, desperate intensity. That complete trash Liu Zhenshang actually died at your hands. He failed because of you. He didn't make a single move to attack me again. He knew his current physical state couldn't withstand another silver-white round. The very next second, his physical form began to turn strangely illusory and distorted under the dim lights of the alley, and the surrounding pocket of space rippled and churned like waves in a pool of water. It was a high-level, complex spatial escape skill. Kid, even if you miraculously possess an ancient inheritance, it won't change the final outcome of this world. The masked man's voice echoed, sounding detached as it drifted out from the opening void realm. The Dragon Spine project has already been fully activated and cannot be stopped. Exactly 7 days from now, this wretched city will welcome the arrival of the true gate. Your precious legacy will become nothing more than the best, most delicious sacrifice for the blood god. The spatial ripples suddenly subsided into a single point, snapping shut. The masked man had completely vanished from my senses, leaving no trace behind. Absolute. Ringing silence returned to the interior of the tin-roofed house. The dark green poison mist rapidly dissipated into thin air, losing the constant psionic support of its caster. I slowly lowered Silver Soul, the barrel still warm against my palm, and turned my body to look down at the poison master lying motionless on the ground. The old man lay slumped against the base of the broken medicine rack, his breathing shallow, ragged, and wet. The open-eye curse tattoo on the back of his left hand had completely shriveled and cracked, leaking a thin, foul-smelling black fluid instead of blood, the unmistakable price of a total goo poison backlash. I stepped over the ruined floorboards and knelt beside him, my expanded soul perception scanning his internal state. His life force was draining away rapidly, like water through a sieve. The desperate final technique had completely burned out his remaining meridians and hollowed out his life force. "Don't waste your energy on me, kid," the old man wheezed, his cloudy eyes gaining a brief, frantic moment of absolute clarity as he looked up at me. He reached out with trembling, blackened fingers, grabbing the edge of my tactical suit jacket with surprising desperation. The bird beak. He was Eagle Beak, one of the primary executioners of the Blood Eye Society. His spatial escape means he is already reporting your ancient energy to their higher-ups. He coughed violently, a dark crimson stain pooling at the corner of his wrinkled mouth, but he forced himself to squeeze out the remaining words, his grip tightening. 7 days. What he said about the Dragon Spine project is real. They have spent years secretly burying spatial resonance arrays along the 7-day Dragon Spine mountain range bordering the city. They want to sacrifice every living soul in Xinjiang to rip open a permanent gate for their dark gods. You must stop them before the 7th day. His hand suddenly lost all its remaining strength, slipping from my jacket and falling heavily onto the blood-stained animal mat below. The final spark of life left his eyes. his head slumping to the side as his breathing stopped entirely. I stood up slowly, the cold, stale air of the destroyed shack pressing against my skin. My face remained entirely flat and expressionless, but deep within my mind, a cold, unyielding calculation was already taking shape. 7 days, a definitive timeline. The prompt on my blue system screen refreshed silently, locking in the new parameters of my survival. Main objective updated. Disrupt the Blood Eye Society's Dragonspine project. Time remaining, 168 hours. I didn't stay in the destroyed iron shack a single second longer than necessary. Leaving the old man's cold corpse behind on the beast hide mat, I stepped out of the broken doorway, melted into the dark, labyrinthine alleyways of the underground black market, and quietly returned to the surface city before the local law enforcement or other criminal elements could track the residual psionic fluctuations of the battle. The 7-day countdown was already ticking downward inside my mind with mechanical precision. Every passing hour was a step closer to the total annihilation of Xinjiang City. To disrupt a massive, deeply entrenched operation like the Dragon Spine Project, raw combat power alone wouldn't cut it. I needed precise, actionable intelligence on the exact locations of those hidden spatial resonance arrays the Blood Eye Society had spent years burying along the mountain range. My first stop was a covert information brokerage operating out of a dimly lit, high-end tea house in the commercial district. Relying on the remaining funds and authorization tokens I had stripped from Liu Zhenxiang's personal storage bracelet, I easily bypassed the front security and gained access to a private, soundproof terminal room. My fingers became a blur across the mechanical keyboard as I aggressively hacked into the local public records, cross-referencing recent land development surveys, unauthorized seismic anomalies, and unusual logistical movements around the 7-day Dragon Spine Mountains over the past 5 years. As the encrypted files slowly decrypted on the monitor, my newly unlocked soul perception remained highly active, expanding outward in a steady, invisible radius to monitor the entire building. The increased sensitivity allowed me to catch the micro-vibrations of the floorboards and the muted conversations of the patrons 2 rooms over, ensuring no one was creeping up on my position. Suddenly, a hidden file directory marked with a secure blood-red vertical pupil icon flashed onto the screen. My eyes narrowed to pinpricks as I bypassed the defensive firewalls, forcing the data to display. It was a complete, detailed map of the Dragon Spine mountain range, and mapped out across its jagged peaks were 3 specific, highly concentrated energy nodes, forming the foundation of a massive spatial ritual. The digital blueprint projected a sickly red glow against my face as I analyzed the stolen data schematic. The Blood Eye Society's design was terrifyingly efficient. The 3 hidden spatial resonance arrays were arranged in a massive, precise triangle spanning the highest peaks of the 7-day Dragon Spine mountain range. The first node, designated the Eye of Ingress, was buried deep within an abandoned, flooded iron mine on the northern ridge, utilizing the natural iron deposits to amplify the spatial frequency. The second node, the Core of Resonance, sat directly beneath a heavily fortified private villa on the southern slope, heavily guarded by contracted mercenary squads, oblivious to the true nature of their employer. The final node, the Gateway Anchor, was positioned at the absolute summit, the highest peak where the spatial barrier between our reality and the void was thinnest. If all 3 nodes were allowed to synchronize and fully power up on the 7th day, they would create a localized gravitational collapse, tearing open a massive, permanent rift that would swallow the entire city whole. I didn't waste a single millisecond memorizing the exact GPS coordinates and structural weak points of each node before cleanly wiping my digital footprint from the tea house terminal. My soul perception suddenly picked up a slight rhythmic clicking sound from the corridor outside, the distinct tread of tactical combat boots moving with deliberate, synchronized intent. 2 individuals were approaching my room from different angles, their internal psionic energy signatures registering at level 32. Eagle Beak's report had clearly reached the local sectors. The hunt for my ancient legacy had officially begun. I smoothly pulled my silver soul rifle from its quick-release case, checking the silver-white purification energy still humming quietly within the chamber. I didn't plan to flee through the back window. With only 164 hours remaining on the countdown, every single level 30-plus assassin sent my way wasn't a threat. They were simply a walking source of high-purity psionic cores that I could aggressively harvest to fuel my own imminent breakthroughs. I turned toward the heavy oak door, my face a mask of absolute, calculated calm as the door handle began to slowly turn. The heavy oak door didn't just slide open. It was gently, silently pushed inward by an invisible telekinetic force. The exact millisecond the gap widened to 3 inches, a dense, localized wave of pressurized sonic vibrations blasted into the private terminal room, aimed directly at my ears to rupture my eardrums and scramble my equilibrium. But my soul perception had already mapped the precise acoustic frequency of the attack before it even cleared the threshold. I simply tilted my body 3 degrees to the left, allowing the destructive sound wave to smash harmlessly into the terminal monitor behind me, shattering the screen into a cascade of sparking glass. Before the dust from the screen could settle, I lunged forward, my movements a fluid, seamless blur driven by ultimate combat mastery. The first assassin, a lean man wearing a reinforced leather trench coat, widened his eyes in absolute shock as I materialized right in his blind spot before his telekinetic wave had even dissipated. He frantically tried to raise his hands to construct a secondary kinetic barrier, but my silver soul rifle was already up. I didn't pull the trigger. Instead, I used the heavy, reinforced buttstock of the weapon to strike his chin with absolute, bone-crushing physical velocity. His jaw shattered instantly with a sickening crack, the massive kinetic impact lifting his entire body off the floor and slamming him hard into the corridor ceiling before he collapsed into an unconscious, bleeding heap. Target has high-level physical enhancement. Fall back. The second assassin, stationed at the opposite end of the hallway, screamed into his tactical comlink, his fingers frantically reaching for a high-grade plasma grenade at his utility belt. He never got the chance to prime it. My right wrist snapped with mechanical precision, aligning the glowing silver-white barrel of Silver Soul directly with his chest. I pulled the trigger. A single, high-velocity projectile wrapped in a faint silver purification sheen tore through the air, piercing straight through his reinforced tactical vest and blowing a clean, fist-sized hole through his torso. The man dropped instantly, his lifeless fingers slipping from the unprimed grenade as it rolled harmlessly across the carpeted floor. Within less than 3 seconds, the corridor fell completely silent once more. I stepped over the pools of blood, my face entirely flat and expressionless as I knelt down to aggressively harvest the high-purity level 32 psionic cores from their chests, pocketing them into my storage space. 163 hours remained. It was time to head north toward the first node, the abandoned iron mine. The rain outside the tea house began to pour in heavy vertical sheets, washing the neon-lit streets of Qingjiang City in a cold, blurry sheen. I slipped through the emergency exit, bypassing the main streets entirely, and commandeered a dark, heavy-duty tactical motorcycle parked in the shadowed alleyway. Hot-wiring the ignition took less than 3 seconds under my automation-honed mechanical intuition. With a low, throaty growl of the engine, the bike shot forward into the storm, tearing toward the northern suburbs, where the jagged peaks of the 7-day Dragon Spine mountain range loomed like sleeping monsters against the black sky. As the city skyline slowly faded into a distant hazy glow behind me, the air turned noticeably colder, thick with a damp, earthy scent of pine and rotting vegetation. The winding mountain road was completely deserted, slick with mud and debris washed down from the steep cliffs. Relying on the hyper-focused tracking of my soul perception, I pushed the motorcycle to its absolute mechanical limits, taking the sharp hairpins with absolute terrifying precision without even slowing down. My mind was entirely locked onto the internal 162-hour countdown ticking away inside my brain. The closer I drew to the northern ridge, the more my expanded senses began to pick up a subtle rhythmic distortion in the ambient psionic fields of the mountain. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a low-frequency, artificial vibration that hummed at a specific, unsettling pitch, matching the exact spatial frequency of the Eye of Ingress node I had uncovered from the stolen files. The Blood Eye Society had already begun initializing the array, slowly warming up the machinery to ensure a flawless synchronization on the 7th day. 2 hours later, the muddy road abruptly terminated at a rusted chain-link perimeter fence choked with thorny vines. Beyond the gate, the gaping dark maw of the abandoned iron mine sat nestled against the sheer rock face, looking like a direct path into the underworld. I killed the motorcycle's engine, allowing it to coast silently into a thick patch of ferns, and smoothly unholstered my silver soul rifle. My senses instantly flagged 3 distinct, highly suppressed energy signatures lingering just inside the entrance tunnels, sentries left behind to ensure no one disturbed the ritual's foundation. The air inside the entrance tunnel was thick with the suffocating stench of stagnant water, rust, and old explosives. I kept my footsteps completely silent, blending into the heavy shadows along the uneven rock walls. My expanded soul perception was fully active, casting an invisible net forward into the darkness to trace the exact movements of the 3 sentries. They were stationed at a makeshift checkpoint 50 meters inside, right where the main shaft split into the lower mining levels. "Did you hear that?" One of the guards muttered, his voice echoing faintly off the wet stone. He adjusted his tactical visor, scanning the gloom. The perimeter sensors on the outer fence just went dead. "Probably just another mountain animal tripped up in the vines." A second voice replied casually, though his hand drifted toward the assault rifle slung across his chest. "Stop jumping at shadows. Eaglebeak is managing the southern villa node. Nobody down here has the guts to mess with the society." They had no idea that Eaglebeak was currently nursing a shattered mask and a ruined arm. I didn't give them a chance to verify their sensors. Using the darkness as absolute cover, I closed the distance in a fraction of a second. Before the first guard could even raise his weapon, I lunged forward. My right hand, completely unburdened by the poison and surging with fully restored power, snapped out like a steel piston, crushing his windpipe with an instantaneous, silent blow. He dropped without a sound. The remaining 2 sentries reacted instantly, their combat instincts kicking in as they tried to leap backward to create distance and open fire. But ultimate combat mastery didn't leave openings. I swung the barrel of my silver soul rifle in a sweeping arc, using the sheer physical momentum to smash the second guard's temple, sending him crashing into the rock wall, unconscious. The third sentry managed to raise his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger, but I was already closer. My left hand gripped his weapon's barrel, twisting it upward violently as my right foot delivered a crushing kick to his sternum. The impact shattered his ribs, throwing his lifeless body 5 meters back into the flooded shaft. The entire skirmish was over in less than 4 seconds. I stood over the fallen guards, my breathing perfectly steady as I leaned down to swiftly extract their level 30 psionic cores, stowing them away. The low-frequency hum of the Eye of Ingress array was getting louder, vibrating through the soles of my boots from the very bottom of the flooded mine. 159 hours remained. The deeper I descended into the subterranean tunnels, the more the water pooling around my combat boots transformed into a thick, oily crimson sludge. The structural beams groaned under the immense spatial pressure radiating from the lower chamber. Reaching the bottom of the main mining shaft, the space suddenly opened up into a massive, hollowed-out cavern filled with ancient iron ore veins that were now pulsing with a volatile, unnatural blood-red light. Directly in the center of the flooded cavern floor sat the Eye of Ingress. The spatial resonance array was a complex, mechanical monolith constructed from dark, unknown alloys, its surface carved with thousands of tiny, glowing channels that funneled the ambient crimson energy directly into a single hovering sphere of distorted space. The low-frequency hum was deafening here, vibrating so violently that it caused the dark water to dance in microscopic, frantic patterns. My soul perception mapped the entire layout in an instant. The machine was already at 42% operational capacity, slowly drilling an invisible hole through the fabric of reality. I didn't waste a single millisecond looking for a control console or a shutdown sequence. I raised my silver soul rifle, focusing the absolute entirety of the pure silver-white light hidden within my soul core directly into the weapon's chamber. The geometric ancient patterns on the barrel, erupted with a blinding, starlight radiance that completely cut through the oppressive red glare of the cavern. I pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. Boom, boom, boom. 3 high-velocity projectiles wrapped in dense, concentrated ancient purification energy tore through the humid air. They slammed directly into the mechanical joints, connecting the alloy monolith to the iron ore veins. The exact millisecond the silver-white starlight touched the blood-red spatial arrays, a violent kinetic chain reaction erupted. The dark alloy melted like wax, and the flowing crimson channels shattered into a million fragments of dead, non-reactive energy. The hovering sphere of distorted space let out a sharp, tearing hiss before violently collapsing inward, snapping shut with a concussive shockwave that sent the oily red water splashing 5 meters into the air. The deafening hum instantly died, replaced by the steady, natural dripping of groundwater. The blue light screen in front of my face refreshed silently. First node. The Eye of Ingress has been completely neutralized. Current progress, 13 nodes disrupted. Time remaining, 156 hours. The violent collapse of the first node sent a powerful, invisible tremor, rippling through the remaining ley lines of the mountain. But within the flooded cavern, the air finally began to clear. The oppressive metallic scent of the blood-red energy rapidly faded, replaced once more by the damp, natural smell of wet stone and old iron ore. I stood completely motionless for several seconds, my boots half submerged in the cooling sludge, as I closed my eyes to let my expanded soul perception stretch outward across the larger geography of the 7-day dragon spine. The destruction of the Eye of Ingress had fractured the stability of the entire triangle. But it hadn't stopped the countdown. The remaining 2 nodes would now likely accelerate their charging sequences to compensate for the massive power deficit, drawing energy directly from the city's underlying grid or the surrounding environment to force the gateway open on schedule. 154 hours remained. The timeline was still entirely manageable, but the parameters of the infiltration had completely changed. With 1 node entirely dark, Eagle Beak and the upper echelons of the Blood Eye Society would instantly notice the sudden drop in the global resonance frequency. The remaining 2 locations, the fortified Southern Villa and the Absolute Summit, would be placed under maximum combat readiness within the hour. Any hope of quiet stealth was officially off the table. I smoothly slung the silver soul rifle back into its tactical casing, my face a mask of cold, unblinking calculation. I didn't care about their heightened security. In a skewed way, an alerted enemy was a predictable enemy. They would consolidate their strongest level 35-plus combat experts around the remaining structures, effectively gathering all their high-purity psionic cores into 2 concentrated geographic areas. Instead of hunting them down individually across the vast mountain range, I could simply march straight into their defensive lines and harvest them all at once. I turned back toward the dark entrance tunnel, my footsteps splashing evenly through the shallow water as I began my ascent back to the surface. It was time to ride south toward the private villa. Breaking back out into the open air of the northern ridge, the mountain storm hit me with a vicious wall of freezing rain and howling wind. I didn't slow my pace for a single second. I vaulted back onto the heavy-duty tactical motorcycle, fired up the engine with a sharp twist of the throttle, and spun the rear tire through the thick mud as I tore back down the winding, hazardous mountain trails. The 152-hour countdown beat a steady, unyielding rhythm against my temples. Behind me, the dark mouth of the iron mine vanished into the sheet of torrential rain, its internal red glare permanently extinguished. But ahead of me, the digital overlay on my vision traced the secondary glowing ley line, stretching all the way across the jagged valleys toward the southern slope. As I rode hard through the midnight blackout, my expanded soul perception acted as an early warning radar, cutting through the dense forest canopy and the blinding downpour to scan the road half a mile ahead. It didn't take long for my senses to flag a sudden, unnatural distortion in the airwaves. The ambient radio frequencies were buzzing with frantic encrypted military-grade transmissions. Alpha Sector went completely dark 2 minutes ago. The resonance frequency dropped by exactly 1/3. All units at the Southern Villa transitioned to maximum alert phase 4 immediately. This is not a drill. Eagle Beak and his operatives had discovered the destruction of the first node much faster than I anticipated. The entire southern perimeter was locking down, turning the private estate into an absolute fortress of high-caliber automated turrets, dense kinetic barriers, and heavily armed awakened mercenaries. I leaned low over the handlebars, pushing the motorcycle's mechanical throttle to its absolute stop, the engine screaming as the bike rocketed down the asphalt. The news didn't change a single variable in my calculation. Let them lock the gates. Let them arm every weapon system they possessed, and let them gather their strongest killers in one tight, claustrophobic courtyard. It only meant I wouldn't have to spend a single millisecond hunting them down. The heavy-duty tactical motorcycle tore through the iron-wrought perimeter gates of the southern estate, at 80 miles an hour, shattering the reinforced security locks into a spray of jagged metal shards. The exact millisecond the bike breached the inner courtyard, 4 automated defense turrets concealed within the manicured hedges swiveled instantly, their dual-barrel plasma cannons lighting up with a brilliant, deadly blue hum as they tracked my trajectory. But my soul perception had already mapped their mechanical rotation speed and dead zones before my tires even touched the gravel. I violently threw the motorcycle low to the left, sliding the heavy frame across the wet stone tiles in a controlled wipeout. A torrent of high-energy plasma bolts zipped past overhead, the intense heat scorching the air and exploding the stone pillars of the main villa entrance into a cascade of dust and debris. Before the motorcycle even ground to a complete halt, I vaulted off the seat, using the forward momentum to launch myself straight toward the closest turret station. My right arm, completely surging with fully restored power, snapped out with mechanical precision. I gripped the reinforced alloy barrel of the automated cannon and twisted violently inward. The structural metal groaned and tore under the immense physical force, ripping the firing mechanism entirely off its mount. Without pausing, I spun on my heel, throwing the heavy, dislodged weapon component, like a kinetic missile, directly into the second turret station across the courtyard, triggering a loud metallic explosion that neutralized both units instantly. Intruder in Sector 2. He's moving too fast. Raise the kinetic barriers. Frantic shouts echoed from the villa's reinforced balcony as 5 heavily armed awakened mercenaries, clad in advanced tactical suits, opened fire with high-caliber assault rifles. A dense curtain of bullets blanketed the courtyard, chewing up the stone tiles. My expanded senses tracked the ballistic path of every incoming round in real time. I unslung the Silver Soul rifle with a fluid flick of my wrist, my face a mask of absolute, calculated calm, as I advanced directly into the teeth of their defensive line. The air hummed with the high-frequency vibration of a shimmering, semi-transparent kinetic barrier that wrapped around the entire main entrance of the villa like a heavy glass dome. The 5 mercenaries behind the shield fired with absolute confidence, believing the defensive wall was completely impenetrable to standard firearms. But they had no idea what kind of energy was chambered inside my weapon. I took a deep, steady breath, channeling the pure silver-white light from my soul core directly into the mechanical receiver of Silver Soul. The geometric ancient patterns etched across the rifle flared with a brilliant starlight radiance that completely washed out the flashing muzzle bursts of the enemy rifles. I didn't spray bullets. I aligned the sights, with the primary power junction connecting the barrier generator to the villa's main grid. Bang! A single projectile wrapped in a dense, swirling cloud of ancient purification energy tore through the reigning courtyard. The exact millisecond the silver-white bullet collided with the shimmering kinetic wall, there was no loud explosion. Instead, the dark, synthetic energy of the barrier began to sizzle and melt away, dissolving like ice under a blowtorch, as the purification light aggressively neutralized its structural integrity. The entire dome shattered into thousands of harmless, fading sparks. Before the mercenaries could even comprehend that their level 40 defensive matrix had been cleanly obliterated by a single shot, I closed the distance. Using the explosive speed of ultimate combat mastery, I vaulted onto the balcony. Moving so fast my body appeared as nothing more than a dark afterimage through the rain. My left fist snapped out, delivering a precise, high-pressure punch directly into the sternum of the nearest shooter, the impact instantly breaking his tactical vest and sending him crashing through the heavy plate glass windows behind him. The remaining 4 men frantically tried to swing their rifle barrels toward my chest, but the distance was already 0. I swung Silver Soul in a tight horizontal arc, using the solid metal frame to crack 2 helmets simultaneously, dropping both guards to the floorboards unconscious before they could even squeeze their triggers. I stepped over the crumpled forms of the mercenaries, my boots leaving wet, crimson footprints across the shattered glass and expensive carpeting of the villa's main foyer. The lavish interior was completely devoid of civilian life. The Blood Eye Society had thoroughly cleared out the estate, transforming the luxury mansion into a stark, operational kill zone. Deep beneath the reinforced floorboards, the heavy, rhythmic vibrations of the core of resonance pulsed with an aggressive intensity. The frequency was noticeably higher and sharper than the first node had been, humming like a disturbed hive of hornets. With the northern array completely destroyed, this second node was forcing its internal capacitance to its absolute threshold, rapidly drawing emergency psionic power from the city's underlying grid to maintain the structural alignment of the upcoming ritual. My expanded soul perception immediately mapped a dense cluster of active energy signatures waiting directly ahead. At the end of the central hallway, a massive reinforced blast door forged from thick titanium alloy sealed off the entrance to the subterranean vaults. Crouched behind a row of heavy tactical barricades in front of the door were the final 3 elite defenders. Level 36 combat specialists wearing heavy mechanized exoskeletons that hummed with independent power cores. Don't let him get close to the door. Fire at will. The 3 heavy combatants didn't rely on standard ballistics. The heavy weapon systems integrated into their right arms spun up instantly, unleashing a blinding torrent of concentrated plasma beams and high velocity. Micro-rockets that completely filled the narrow width of the corridor, turning the entire hallway into a raging inferno of smoke and exploding shrapnel. I didn't slow my advance by a single fraction of a second. Using the predictive spatial mapping of my soul perception, I calculated the exact microsecond intervals between the incoming plasma bursts. I slid low beneath a low-flying rocket, the intense heat singing the shoulders of my tactical jacket, and rebounded off the marble wall with explosive physical velocity. Before the closest mechanized heavy could realign his targeting reticle, I was already inside his guard, my face a mask of absolute, frozen calm. The close-quarters space left the mechanized combatant completely vulnerable to my optimized speed. Before his heavy hydraulic joints could swing his arm cannon around, my left hand drove forward like a wedge, jamming directly into the exposed wiring harness beneath his shoulder armor. I didn't just pull. I channeled a sharp spike of raw psionic energy straight through his system, frying the internal servo motors instantly. The massive steel arm went completely dead, dropping to his side with a heavy, useless clang. He's inside the line, support. The second heavy fighter frantically tried to swing his micro-rocket pod toward me, but my ultimate combat mastery allowed me to use his disabled comrade as a physical shield. I grabbed the first guard's heavy frame, spinning his armored bulk into the line of fire. A volley of plasma rounds melted through the dead exoskeleton's back armor, but I was already moving behind the distraction. I unslung Silver Soul with a fluid flick of my wrist, pressing the glowing barrel directly against the second fighter's reinforced cockpit visor. Bang! The high-purity ancient purification round shattered the reinforced glass like brittle ice, the silver-white energy completely vaporizing his internal cognitive systems without a struggle. He collapsed backward into his own barricade. Turning instantly to the final defender, my movements remained mechanically precise. The man attempted to trigger a self-destruct sequence on his power core to take me out with him, but my soul perception caught the sudden spike in his battery matrix. I lunged forward, driving the bayonet lug of my rifle straight through the central coolant line of his backpack unit. A thick cloud of freezing vapor hissed outward, freezing his mechanical joints, solid in a fraction of a second. He froze completely in place, unable to move a single finger. The corridor fell perfectly silent once more, save for the hum of the dying machinery. I reached into the ruined suits, cleanly harvesting 3 high-purity, level 36 psionic cores and stowing them away. 150 hours remained. I turned my attention to the thick titanium blast door sealing the lower vaults. The massive titanium blast door stood as a cold, impassable barrier at the end of the smoke-filled hallway, its seamless surface locking down the subterranean levels with military-grade finality. There were no visible keypads, handle mechanisms, or standard electronic interfaces on the exterior. It was completely controlled via a remote biometric link deep within the facility's master server. But a physical lock was nothing more than an arrangement of molecules, and my sole perception could trace every microgap and structural locking pin deep within the 3-inch steel plates. I stepped up to the center of the door, planting my boots firmly on the blood-splattered carpet. I slowly lowered the Silver Soul rifle, letting my right hand rest flat against the freezing cold titanium surface. Deep within my chest, the pure silver-white light of my soul core surged violently, channeling down my arm and transforming into an incredibly dense, vibrating harmonic pulse. I didn't try to blow the door off its hinges with raw kinetic force. Instead, I used the frequency mapping of my senses to match the exact resonance frequency of the internal locking gears. Sizzle! The intense, concentrated starlight energy of the ancient purification light bled straight through the metal seams. Inside the door, the massive hydraulic locking bolts began to glow a deep, molten red as their molecular bonds rapidly dissolved under the purification effect. Less than 3 seconds later, the internal machinery completely melted into useless slag. With a heavy, metallic groan, the pressurized seals hissed outward, and the giant titanium doors slowly drifted apart, revealing a dark, yawning stairwell leading down into the concrete vaults below. The air rising from the depths was burning hot, thick, with the smell of ozone and overcharged electrical transformers. The rhythmic hum of the core of resonance had reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating so intensely that it made my teeth ache. I unslung Silver Soul once more, my face a flat, frozen mask of calculation as I stepped past the melting threshold and began my rapid descent into the true heart of the southern node. 148 hours remained. The subterranean vault was a massive concrete bunker completely dominated by a sprawling network of overcharged electrical transformers and thick, pulsing copper cables that lined the walls like exposed veins. In the absolute center of the room stood the core of resonance. Unlike the first array, this machine was twice as large, its metallic chassis wrapped in an intense, crackling shell of blood-red plasma that arced violently to the reinforced ceiling. The central spatial sphere hovering above the core was highly unstable, its edges rippling and tearing at the airwaves as it desperately pulled power to compensate for the lost northern node. Standing guard directly in front of the terminal console was a sewn figure, a tall, heavily augmented cyborg, whose entire left side was encased in dark, military-grade chrome. His mechanical red eye whirled to a focus the moment my boots cleared the doorway. "You're too late, boy," the cyborg rasped, his voice a synthesized drone. "The core is already past the point of a safe shutdown. Try to destroy it now, and the resulting spatial feedback will vaporize this entire mountain ridge." "I don't plan on shutting it down," I replied flatly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Before he could process my words, I lunged forward. The cyborg raised a heavy, high-output plasma rifle, but my ultimate combat mastery had already predicted his firing vector. I shifted my weight mid-stride, letting the superheated plasma beam melt the concrete wall behind me, and drove the buttstock of Silver Soul hard into his mechanical neck joint. The heavy impact tore through the hydraulic lines, spraying sparks and synthetic oil as his massive frame crashed to the floor, completely immobilized. I stepped past his writhing body and approached the humming console. I didn't touch the keyboard. Instead, I rammed the glowing silver-white barrel of my rifle straight into the main coolant intake valve beneath the core. I flooded the machine with the absolute maximum output of my ancient purification energy. The pure starlight light didn't stabilize the red plasma. It violently accelerated the electrical frequency, forcing the overcharged transformers past their absolute physical limits. Warning: Core containment failure imminent. The automated system screamed through the klaxons. The overcharged transformers lining the concrete walls screamed as they redlined, venting thick plumes of white, pressurized smoke that smelled heavily of burning synthetic insulation. The blood-red plasma shell enveloping the machine began to violently warp, shrinking and expanding unevenly as my ancient purification light forced its core frequencies to completely destabilize. Critical overload. Containment field collapse in 5 seconds. The mechanical emergency klaxon blared into the smoke-filled bunker. I didn't wait to watch the final countdown. Pivoting on my heel, I sprinted back toward the dark exit stairwell, my movements a flawless blur of physical execution. Behind me, the cyborg's mechanical eye flickered frantically in the blinding white and red glare as the central spatial sphere hovering above the console suddenly fractured into a dozen jagged, weeping cracks. Boom! A massive, concussive energy shockwave erupted from the heart of the vault, throwing a towering wall of localized gravitational force directly outward. The concrete floorboards buckled and ripped upward like paper, and the massive copper cables lining the walls tore away from their brackets in a spray of white-hot electrical arcs. The intense pressure slammed hard against the titanium blast doors behind me, but I had already cleared the threshold, using the raw kinetic backdraft of the explosion to launch myself further up the concrete stairs. As I broke back out into the main foyer of the villa, the entire structure groaned, the expensive glass chandeliers shattering simultaneously as the subterranean vibration ripped through the foundation. The brilliant red ley line connecting this estate to the rest of the mountain range violently snapped, its residual energy dissolving into thousands of harmless, fading crimson sparks that drifted up into the heavy rain outside. I checked the blue light screen refreshing in front of my eyes. Second node. The core of resonance has been completely neutralized. Current progress. 2-3 nodes disrupted. Time remaining 145 hours. Only one node remained active, the absolute summit of the 7-day Dragon Spine mountain range. The cold, torrential rain immediately washed the stench of ozone and burnt synthetic oil from my tactical jacket the exact millisecond I stepped back out into the ruined courtyard. Behind me, the lavish southern villa continued to groan and fracture, its structural foundation completely compromised by the localized gravitational shockwave of the collapsing node. I didn't look back. My expanded soul perception swept the immediate perimeter, confirming that the remaining mercenary forces had completely scattered in panic after their defensive matrix was shattered and their heavy mechanized units went permanently offline. I strode past the smoldering remains of the automated turrets and vaulted back onto the heavy-duty tactical motorcycle. With a sharp, aggressive twist of the throttle, the engine roared back to life, the rear tire kicking up a massive spray of wet gravel as I shot out through the shattered iron gates and back onto the winding mountain road. The digital overlay mapping my vision had changed. With the northern and southern arrays utterly destroyed, the delicate triangular synchronization of the Dragon Spine project was broken. However, the Blood Eye Society hadn't abandoned the ritual. Instead, looking up through the violent canopy of the storm, I could see a terrifying physical manifestation of their desperation. A massive, concentrated pillar of dense, blood-red energy was shooting straight up into the black storm clouds from the absolute highest peak of the mountain range. The gateway anchor. By destroying the outer nodes, I had forced all of the residual psionic energy within the mountain's ley lines to violently funnel directly into the final array. The sky above the summit was already beginning to warp and twist, flashing with jagged streaks of crimson lightning as the fabric of the void realm strained against our reality. They were trying to force the gate open early. The 144-hour countdown was technically still ticking, but the parameters had shifted into an immediate, high-stakes sprint. Eagle Beak, having survived our encounter in the underground clinic, would undoubtedly be stationed at that peak, commanding the last, most fanatical remnants of the Blood Eye Society's high-level executioners. The steep asphalt road eventually gave way to a sheer, treacherous dirt trail, winding up the side of the final cliff face. I pushed the mechanical limits of the motorcycle, until the engine block overheated and the tires lost all traction in the thick, freezing mud. Abandoning the bike on the edge of a ravine, I slung the Silver Soul rifle tightly across my back and began the final vertical climb on foot. The air grew thinner and colder with every step, vibrating with a chaotic, maddening psionic hum. I was heading straight into the eye of the storm. The physical pressure at the summit of the 7-day Dragon Spine mountain range was intense enough to crack stone. As my boots cleared the final jagged ledge, a freezing, howling gale threatened to throw me straight off the vertical cliff face into the abyss below. The sky directly above was no longer black. It had been completely replaced by a swirling, violent maelstrom of deep crimson clouds that rotated around a single, weeping tear in the fabric of reality. In the center of the wide, windswept plateau stood the gateway anchor. The final array was a towering, triangular monument of dark obsidian stone, pulsing in direct synchronization with the bleeding sky. Funneled by the destruction of the previous 2 nodes, the concentrated psionic energy of the entire mountain was screaming through the structure, charging it at a visible, terrifying rate. "I knew you would come, kid." A familiar hoarse voice drifted through the roaring wind. Standing directly beneath the shadow of the pulsating obsidian monument was the bird-beak masked man, Eagle Beak. The right side of his pale porcelain mask was gone, exposing a face twisted by horrific spatial burns and unadulterated hatred. His right arm had been completely replaced by a crude, glowing red biomechanical prosthetic that hummed with volatile blood energy. Flanking him on either side were the last 4 high-level executioners of the Blood Eye Society, their internal psionic signatures registering at a formidable level 42. They stood completely motionless, their weapons drawn and locked onto my position. "You destroyed the outer nodes, but you only succeeded in gathering all the sacrificial power into one single point." Eagle Beak growled, his biomechanical hand clenching into a fist as the crimson lightning flashed above. "The gate is already opening. Even if you kill us all, you cannot stop the arrival of the Blood God. Your ancient inheritance ends here tonight." I unslung Silver Soul from my back with a slow, deliberate motion, my face remaining an absolute frozen mask of cold calculation. I didn't waste a single breath responding to his words. My soul perception expanded outward one final time, perfectly mapping the exact structural vulnerabilities of the obsidian anchor and the precise tactical movements of the 5 killers before me. The 4 level 42 executioners didn't wait for a command. Moving with synchronized, lethal speed, they scattered into a loose semicircle to flank me, their bodies trailing dark crimson afterimages as they activated their high-level psionic movement techniques. The 2 executioners on the left raised heavy, long-barreled railguns that hummed with a terrifying mechanical whine, while the 2 on the right unsheathed twin psionic blades that crackled with unstable, tearing plasma energy. They were elite killers, hardened by dozens of brutal operations, and they knew better than to underestimate the silver-white light that had broken their society's defensive lines. Die! The railguns roared simultaneously, sending 2 hypersonic, armor-piercing projectiles tearing through the freezing mist directly toward my skull. At the exact same millisecond, the blade wielders lunged from the blind spots, their plasma swords cutting 2 horizontal arcs designed to decapitate me if I attempted to dodge the ballistic rounds. But my ultimate combat mastery didn't calculate a retreat. I stood firmly planted on the freezing stone floor, my face a flat mask of cold, unblinking calculation. My soul perception tracked the exact spatial trajectories of the bullets and the micro-vibrations of the incoming blades in real time. I didn't step back. Instead, I swung the Silver Soul rifle in a brutal, vertical upward slash. The reinforced steel barrel collided directly with the first plasma blade with a deafening metallic clang. The sheer physical momentum of my restored right arm, overpowering the executioner's grip and forcing his weapon upward into the exact path of the incoming railgun projectile. Boom! The hypersonic round blew the executioner's own plasma blade into a shower of white-hot shrapnel that shredded his tactical suit, dropping him instantly to the stone floor. Without pausing a single fraction of a second, I used the recoil of the impact to spin on my heel, my left foot snapping out in a devastating high-pressure sweep that caught the second blade wielder directly in the knee joint. The bone shattered with a sickening, wet crunch, and as his body collapsed forward, I drove the buttstock of Silver Soul hard into his temple, neutralizing him instantly before his companions could even chamber their next rounds. The remaining two railgun executioners backed away frantically, their boots skidding on the slick, frozen stone as they tried to re-establish a safe firing distance. But my expanded soul perception left them zero avenues for retreat. I lunged through the freezing mountain mist, my movements a fluid, mechanical blur driven by ultimate combat mastery. Before the first shooter could chamber another hypersonic round, I swung the glowing barrel of Silver Soul in a tight, horizontal arc, shattering his weapon's receiver into a spray of dead gears and slamming the heavy steel frame into his jaw. He collapsed instantly, unconscious. The final executioner screamed in desperation, abandoning his railgun to draw a high-frequency plasma dagger. He lunged wildly at my chest, but my left hand snapped out like a steel vise, gripping his wrist mid-air and twisting it violently downward until the bone snapped. I stripped the plasma weapon from his limp fingers and drove the buttstock of my rifle into his sternum, throwing his lifeless bulk 5 meters back against the base of the obsidian monument. Useless trash, all of you. Eagle Beak roared, his pale face twisting into a mask of pure madness as he stepped forward. His biomechanical right arm erupted with an intense, crackling shell of unstable crimson plasma. He swung the massive prosthetic directly at my head, the sheer spatial friction tearing the air open with a deafening hiss. I didn't dodge. I stood firmly planted on the shivering peak, channeling the absolute entirety of the pure silver-white light hidden within my soul core straight into the mechanical receiver of Silver Soul. The geometric ancient patterns etched across the rifle flared with a blinding, starlight radiance that completely obliterated the dark crimson shadows of the summit. Bang! I pulled the trigger right as his plasma fist cleared my guard. The high-purity ancient purification round didn't just pierce his prosthetic. The concentrated starlight energy bled straight into his mechanical arm's power matrix, violently reversing the electrical frequency. The dark alloy melted instantly, and the crimson energy exploded inward, blowing Eagle Beak backward into the dark obsidian anchor. He slumped against the base of the structure, his mechanical eye flickering rapidly before going completely dark. Without wasting a single millisecond, I swiveled the glowing barrel of my rifle upward, aligning it directly with the core of the pulsating triangular monument. The sky directly above the absolute summit of the 7-day Dragon's Spine mountain range let out a horrific, tearing shriek as the weeping rift in reality widened by another 2 inches. A thick, suffocating cloud of dark void energy began to bleed down like black ink, creeping toward the tip of the pulsating obsidian monument. I didn't waste a single millisecond looking at the bleeding sky or the unconscious form of Eagle Beak slumped against the base. My face remained a completely flat, expressionless mask of absolute calculated finality. I firmly planted my boots on the shivering stone peak, drawing the absolute last drop of the pure silver-white starlight, hidden within my soul core. The ancient, geometric patterns etched across the entire length of Silver Soul didn't just glow. They erupted into a blinding, magnificent pillar of pure purification light that shot straight up into the dark mist, completely neutralizing the freezing wind and rain in a 10-meter radius. Bang! I squeezed the trigger for the final time. The high-purity, ancient purification projectile tore through the air, carrying the absolute, concentrated legacy of the ancient line. It slammed directly into the central energy nexus, located at the geometric center of the dark obsidian anchor. The exact millisecond the silver-white starlight touched the dark alloy, there was no loud explosion. Instead, the massive triangular monument began to violently sizzle and melt away, its structural molecular bonds dissolving into nothingness like ice under a solar flare. The flowing blood-red channels shattered into millions of dead, non-reactive fragments, and the massive pillar of dense crimson energy shooting into the sky instantly snapped. Above me, the weeping rift let out a dull, frustrated rumble as its power source vanished entirely. Deprived of the anchor's resonance, The fabric of space violently snapped back together, sealing the tier completely and leaving nothing behind but a clear, peaceful night sky filled with distant, natural stars. The oppressive, chaotic psionic vibrations that had choked the mountain range for 5 years instantly died, replaced by the gentle, quiet whistling of a natural alpine breeze. The blue light screen in front of my eyes refreshed silently for the final time. Final node. The gateway anchor has been completely destroyed. The Dragon Spine project has been permanently terminated. Xinjiang City is secure. Current progress. 3 nodes neutralized. Time remaining, 141 hours. I slowly lowered the silver soul rifle, its ancient geometric patterns fading back into a calm, dormant silver sheen. Turning my back on the melting obsidian slag and the defeated remnants of the Blood Eye Society, I walked evenly toward the ledge of the cliff, my silhouette outlined by the first pale rays of dawn breaking over the distant city skyline.